buried alive. An accusation. Infertile. I heard her cries. The vultures knew the valley before I did. They rode the thermals over Black Mesa like they owned the sky, dark specks stitched against the heat. I had seen them 1,000 times. Picked clean bones tell you where the world forgets people. But that afternoon, something else rode the wind. A sound that did not belong to wind or beast. A human voice, thin and raw, threaded with dirt and shock. I left the horse and went down. The ravine smelled of sun-baked clay and old sweat. The ground was cracked in blue lines, the kind that wrinkle when the river forgets to come. Halfway down I saw it, a mound of earth with a woman's head staring at the sky. Her hair was matted with grit, her throat had dried mud like a collar. A wooden placard hung from a spear planted beside her, the word carved deep and blunt, infertile. Her mouth moved. She made a sound that could not yet be called a word. It was a cry and a question and a prayer all at once. I kneeled and put my hands to her shoulders and started digging with my bare fingers. The dirt tasted metallic with heat. Her skin was baked, stretched over bone, but the eyes, God help me, were not gone. They were alive and small and furious. Arrows thudded into the ridge above me. A hiss of wooden shafts through hot air raised the hair on my forearms. I am no fool. I have been made of other people's bullets, and still I feel the old muscle memory. Where to stand, when to breathe. I cupped my hand over her mouth to stop the soil from filling it, and I dug until my knuckles bled, and then I dragged her out like a sinner hauled from a shallow grave. They shot at us as we ran. One arrow nicked my shoulder, and I felt the sting like a memory. The horse was frantic, white foam at his bit, and I swung the woman up across the saddle in front of me, the way you would lift an animal you hope will live. Her weight was all bone and a slow, grinding ache. She whispered something that might have been a name or the last of the life she'd been let keep. We dropped into the scrub toward my cabin, faster than I wanted to go. The valley rides with a look in its belly on afternoons like that, the kind that makes men do quick things and worse. I rode through a burst of glassy light and into the shade, like a promise. Only when the porch boards cursed under my boots and the door was shut and the bolt was thrown did I let myself look. She was breathing, not much, but the chest lifted and fell. Dirt fell from her hair in black clots. A thin line of dried blood tracked down her temple. I stripped some shirts off the bed and wrapped her, then set a wash basin on the floor and began. Water, scraped dirt, boiled herbs, small things I had learned or made up to keep living people living. Her skin under the grime was the color of riverstone, and when I took the placard from around her neck, I felt a cold that didn't belong to the room. She tasted of dust and something like iron. When she spoke, her voice came out as a blade of glass. Sajale, she said, and held on to the sound as if it might tether her to the world. The name fit her fragile jaw in a way that made me want to keep it true. Sheriff Rourke Hale came door-knocking not long after I had her warmed against the hearth. He had deputies and a notebook, and that look of a man who sells the law like a wagon wheel sells iron. He stood on my porch and cleared his throat like he was doing me a courtesy by bending the law over my chest. "You can't be harboring," he began. "You can't bury a woman alive and call it law," I said, and closed the door. His voice through the wood said, "His honor." And I opened the door a little and showed him the placard. He paled in the way a man does when a smell crosses him he can't sell. He wanted paper and signatures. He wanted me to hand Sajal over so he could take her down to the town and let the magistrate decide what to do with a woman branded void by the gossip of men and the superstitions of those who profit from fear. He said procedure. He said community safety. He didn't say the part where Silas Grilly's cattle ran an extra mile onto the flats when folks were frightened enough to leave. "I won't hand her to you," I told him. "Not today." He stamped his foot and left, but he left men behind like a smell, deputies sitting in the shade, watching for a chance to take the easy coin of obedience. They were the kind who turn a blind eye until pressing comes, and they would press if Silas wanted it. I had known men like that long enough to know better than to trust a badge when the ridge smells of somebody else's money. After he left, I sat by the stove. Sajale slept in a fever-swinging sleep. I found myself watching the place where vultures had threaded the sky and thinking of a time before the smoke and the black horses, a time when I learned to make a daughter laugh until she choked on joy. I don't speak of her, Elizabeth. No one needs more stories to make them soft. But the picture was there like a wound that doesn't alter with new clothes. It was the reason I had set up a cabin against such a hard land, to be a place to bring people who couldn't stand on their own anymore. She woke with the lamplight and the smell of broth. She looked at the basin like a stranger looking at a town he used to know. Her hands flexed and found the cloths, and she set them aside with a steady that surprised me. When she spoke, it was in short sentences, words used like tools to rebuild something. "They said I was cursed," she said. "Dasan, he said I was cursed." I had heard that name in whispers and alehouse murmurs for weeks. Dasan, a medicine man of sorts, rumoured to practice things that made folks comfortable with the idea of curses and kinship. There are men who trade in blame because blame keeps them yoked to power. Sajali said his name like a bruise. "They nailed him?" I asked. "They—" She made a small sound that was not a word. "He spoke for others. They listened. They wanted land. They wanted story. I was easy to mark. You don't own a valley unless you are willing to name its inhabitants as less than human. Less than human is how cheap men stake their claim." Silas Grilly had been pushing people off the flats for longer than I had known the weight of a rifle. He bought men, and he bought silence. He had not bought the law. He bought the men who would bend it. Over the next days, we did what you do when you are trying to make a person whole. We boiled broth, we wrapped open places, we tried to make the light less sharp. Sajale slept and spat mud from her mouth and woke uneasy and afraid to close her eyes. I listened to her breathing at night and felt like a man who had been given a book with the last pages torn out. She refused pity with a fierceness I had seen only in men who had been told they no longer mattered. She refused to be a charity. "I can walk," she told me the third morning. "I can earn my food." "You've been buried," I said. "You should not be walking a lot." "A woman gets buried and the world says she is less. I don't want to be less." She taught herself to stand with a small stubbornness. We improvised. I showed her how to clean a rifle. She held it like she was learning to read. Her first tries were bad. The recoil jerked her shoulder, and the bullets hit the rocks and whistled by like small wrong things. But she watched her own hands and came back again. There is a kind of teaching you do with someone who has been stripped of agency. You show them their power piece by piece. She wanted to be dangerous if she had to be. She wanted not to be a thing to be given or taken. We found out the names for the reasons that had put her beneath a placard. She had been married to a man who'd taken advantage of her silence and then turned his shoulder when the cattle a man like Grilly wanted moved past his fence. Dasan, it seemed, had sided publicly with Grilly on some council of men who valued property over life. Politics wrapped itself in the language of the sacred, and Sajal had been the simplest token. A woman without a child, a wound catcher in a field of greedy men. At night, she would sit on the porch and ask questions about the war, and I would answer because there was nothing else I could offer. I told her little things, how the 3rd Cavalry learned to be quiet, the sting of a misfired shot, the way a man arrives home and discovers his house has a new ghost. I did not tell her everything because I do not like to sell my scars as instruction. She understood loss in her own currency. A week in, a messenger from town arrived with the manner of a man sent to measure a house for foreclosure. He left a note pinned to my door, Silas Grilly's name scrawled on it, and something like a demand. The letter said he wanted Sajale handed over, alive, wounded, or in some way obedient to the bargain he intended to make with his neighbors and the sheriff. The language was polite. The meaning was not. We did not wait for men to form polite lines. Men like Grilly prefer legal steps, petitions, deputations, the grinding of the law wheel until people with no money go under its teeth. He had already tried that. When law did not move fast enough, he resorted to other things. There was a man at the edge of town who loved fire and led men who loved the idea of burning things to make a point. We prepared. Preparation in this country is not heroic. It's staples and trenches, a fence wired to hold a man out, and a trap set to make him think twice. I taught Sajal how to dig a foxhole the way you teach a child to count their fingers. She learned to listen to the land, where the dust lay an hour after a wagon, where a horse's tracks held a story. She learned the small, cruel mercies that keep you breathing. There were nights when she woke and walked to the window and watched the far ridge where men gather. Her face then was not small or broken. It was gathering something long and slow, a readiness. Once, while we were cleaning rifles, she laughed at herself because the recoil still surprised her. It was not a joy that made me soft. It was the sort of laughter that comes from a woman finding out she can do more than survive. She made a wooden peg for a sling the same day, and when she wrapped the leather, she hummed under her breath, like someone returning a song to its right owner. Word runs faster than a horse when men try to excuse a sin with a coin. People came to the edges of my land, some with eyes that flinched at Sajal like at a scandal, some with mouths that tasted of better days and wanted nothing to do with trouble. Eli, an old hand who runs the livery, came and brought oats and a look that said he had enough sense to see the math. "Grilly's not a friend of people," he said, sitting on the step, and spat charcoal into the dust. "He buys more than cows." Mercer and Luke Carter came one evening with coffee and a flat, nervous resentment. They did not ask me to hand her over. They asked what I needed. Mercy comes to stubborn places like that, not with speeches but tools. They were the kind of neighbors that don't pretend the world is just practical. They put up a pallet and mended the fence where a thief could have come through. They listened and then left quietly with their boots full of dirt and promises. I did not tell them about the thing I carried the way a man carries a weight of guilt. The war had given me marks that no water could wash out. We had both been in towns and seen women look at us as if our name meant trouble. I had the reflex of a man who will shoot to keep the past from swallowing the present. Sajale smelled of dust and courage. I felt like a man who had been given a second chance not to atone, but to try better. The sheriff kept his men at the edges like bad weather. He came a few times and leaned on the porch and tried the arithmetic of the law like it was a loom. Each time he left less sure. The angle of his hat betrayed a man who is used to being bribed and finds himself with an empty hand. He would tip his chin towards my door and later go and sit where Silas had the better ale. Silas Grilly was a man built by greed. He had a ranch that reached like an ugly hand and calves that made men hungry. He came to my land one day with the swagger of a man who had paid for silence and found none. He stood 2 paces from my fence and spat and said, "You sheltering thieves now, Redfern?" "I shelter people," I said, "not thieves." "Sajale is trouble," he said with all the malice of a man who always wants what he wants. "She's worth more to me in the hands of law than in your bed. You would do right to hand her over before something bad happens to my cattle." I felt the sharp logic of his sentence like a stone in my gut. Men like Grilly do not reckon by law or kindness. They reckon by fear and the leverage they can get over it. He left after I spat back enough for him to feel the terrain was not his alone, but his leave had the taste of a challenge. So we trained. She learned to plate her fear in something she could hold. The first time she fired a live round, it punched a small hole in the far fence, and she cried out like a child and then laughed, a sound that was half victory and half sorrow. She was no small thing then. She was a woman taking the form of a weapon she could know. Her hands were strong in ways men did not expect. She could hold a blade and knead dough, and in one afternoon learned to reassemble a rifle as if she'd been born with the parts in her hands. She kept a small pouch of herbs she said she had used for salves and old hurts. I never asked for the knowledge of where she had learned them. Some things are private as prayer. One night a volley of arrows kissed the roof, not aimed to kill, men like to make points, but to rattle. Sajale was awake and at the window with a lamp. She watched the men on the ridge, as if she were reading the lines of a bad story, and then, quietly, she put a shell in the chamber and went to the door. I tried to stop her. She looked at me like the land when it's had enough of being troubled. "If they come for me," she said, "they will meet me." "You don't have to go," I said. "I was dug out of the earth so someone else could choose for me," she said. "I'm not going to be dug into it again." Her mouth shaped words like promises. I had no answer that would hold. What I had was a weapon and a willingness to stand in a doorway. We went out and found tracks in the dirt, riders who had waited for a moon with shorter luck than their tongues. Someone had left a mark with the heel of a boot on our fence, a message that said we were noticed. The porch smelled of smoke and spent gunpowder. The men who had come wanted a show, and they had one. They had not expected the woman in the window to load and step out and put a round into the lantern post with the skill and calm of someone who had decided not to be surprised by her own hands. It was the first time I saw the way a person can be reborn into skill. Her hand did not shake. The bullet went true, and the lantern toppled and guttered. The men on the ridge cursed and rode off for now. That night we sat in a quiet that was not peace, but a truce. It was the sound of two people breathing hard and not lying about what lay ahead. Before dawn, a rider came alone and left a paper tucked into the split rail. It was an ugly thing with the sheriff's mark and Silas Grilly's signature, and it said, in a polite circle of type, that law would be used to reclaim what was theirs. It also said in clearer ink that if we did not cooperate, Grilly would take other means. The kind of means that leaves ash and no one to grieve. I read it twice. Sajali stood behind me holding a cup. She did not ask me what I would do. She expected me to know. I did not, but some part of me answered the kind of way a man learns to atone, by putting himself between a thing and the harm it can do to someone else. "We can move her," Mercer said the next morning. "Take her to the hills. They won't find her there." "She won't run," Sajali said, and the sentence was small and fierce as a seed. "I was buried. I will not be chased." "We don't want to be heroes," Eli said, and he meant it. We wanted to stay breathing and useful. I told them the truth because I could not keep the small dishonesty inside me. If Grilly wanted to clear a claim, he would not stop at the law. Those who make their money by pushing people off land do not value the law unless it's convenient. We had to be ready. So we did what brittle things do. We learned how to hold. We sharpened fence posts and made pits by the gate and set up a line of sight that favored the dirt and the small hills. We put blessed little things into place. Bottles in the ground that would make a man think twice, and a rope that would take the unfair weight off a gate. We were not a militia. We were a handful of neighbors, and a woman who had been stolen from the earth and would not be returned to it. Sajale trained the way a person learns to obey themselves. She practiced at dawn, when the light split the world into long, honest shadows. I took a position against the door, and watched her straighten her shoulders like someone who had climbed out of a canyon and was learning to stand on two legs. She did not smile much then. She tightened her jaw, and there was a new line in it, like a scar you carry with your mouth. One afternoon, as we were mending a fence line, a rider came, Ashcrow. He rode in like a man who had the wind in his back and a story hanging off the saddle. There was a kinship in the way he carried himself, a kind of lean honed by a life with its own rules. I did not trust him because trust is currency, and he wore enough secrets to look wealthy. He dismounted and did not look at Sajale as if she were a thing. He only glanced and then spoke to me. "I didn't know," he said. For a long second I thought he was apologizing for the killing, but men with bronze faces tend to be read by those who have no sense for the histories that run under fine words. He said he had heard of an order of men who had buried a woman and called it justice. He said things that might have been regret or might have been politics. I kept my hand on my pistol and listened, because the truth in men is often wrapped in words that mean little until tested. Ashcrow left with a flat I could not read. He would not interfere, he said, and his eyes told another story, a story of compacts and pressure and the places where men had to choose between a neighbor and a good deal. He is a man with a name that carries weight, and there are those in his people who will stand on the edges or pull a cart with a heavy stone. He had a brother, Dasan, whose name Sajale had given me with the small hurt of betrayal threaded into it. The world is not made of simple villains. It is made of people who make choices. That night by the stove, Sajale told me a thin part of her story, not like a confession, but like a mapping. She had been married once. The husband had been a man with small dreams and a fondness for drink. He had not defended her. When the curandero Dasan had said what he said in the council, men had knotted themselves to that truth because it was easier than owning their own hunger. The accusation of being infertile is a terrible thing in a place that measures people by lineage and inheritance. To be declared empty is to have your name taken. They buried her to make the judgment stick. "Why didn't you leave?" I asked her hard, honestly. The question was for me as much as it was for her. It is easier to judge than to do the thing. "Where would I go?" she said. "A woman has the world of her husband's house and the world of the land. When both are a place of shame, it is hard to be anywhere." That night she slept, and I sat outside and listened for the rustle of men who would come with the cold callousness of those who think in terms of land and profit. The valley held its breath. I heard the coyotes yelp and the wind take up small laments from the grass. I thought of vultures and how they circle, waiting, only now the circling was not guaranteed. We had time, some time to teach, to bind up flesh, to make a space where a woman could choose. But time is a brittle thing in the hands of greedy men. I thought of the way my hand had moved in the dirt, the way my fingers had found her throat and hauled her out. I thought of how that single sound, her cry, had broken a long habit of letting the world spin away people it did not want. I had heard her cries. I had acted. That action had a cost, and these men were already counting it. The week before, the men came in earnest. Sajale and I sat in the late light, and she showed me how to braid rubbery threads of plant root into a poultice that made blisters crawl back into skin. I showed her how to set a sight on a rifle, and then how to breathe like the rifle was part of you. Her fingers found the grain of the wood, like a map. She was no longer only a woman rescued. She was a person knitting herself back to the world by learning how to keep it from taking her again. At dusk on the last night of my telling you this, a rider came over the ridge and dropped a note in the hollow of the gate. It was a short thing with a neat hand. "This is your last warning. Hand over the woman or we take what we need." We did not answer with speech. We answered with preparations. We dug a place in the soft ground and lined it with planks to hide a man when he needed hiding. We set a bottle full of pebbles and dog hair in a shallow pit at the edge of the path that would rattle like 1,000 small stones, and bring the sort of attention a man does not want near his horse. We put the old Remington up where Sajale could reach it in the dark. At midnight, while the moon was a rough coin in the sky, Sajale woke me. "They are moving," she said. Her hand on my shoulder was steady and warm. "I can hear them, and they are too many for the ridge." I did not feel like a hero then. I felt like a man who had to be what he was, a holder of a door. We moved silently. The men on the ridge made the sound of approaching weather, horses and breath and the creak of leather. The taste of iron came into the air like a warning. I checked my rifle and felt its certainty in my hands, like an old friend sharpening his jaw for a fight. Sajal stood at my side with a pouch of cartridges and a look that made the world small. For the first time in a long while, I did not think of atonement. I thought of a woman's voice that had threaded the wind and refused to be shushed. We would meet them at dawn. The valley would wake to bullet and breath and the smell of things that cannot be taken back. I lit a cigarette with hands that did not want to tremble and watched the horizon turn like the slow flip of a page. The vultures were quiet for now, as if waiting to see which story would be written on the land. If this kind of story grips you, tap subscribe and stay for the full ride. Dawn came with a bruise of violet and a smell like rain before it listens. The men arrived in small groups, not all at once, silences stitched between them like a rope. They came with the arrogance of lawmen and the mean appetite of those who come to change a place by removing inconvenient people. We had the advantage of knowing every rock and fold. We had the advantage of a woman who had learned the language of a rifle and a handful of neighbors who had chosen to keep a secret they thought worth the risk. The first shots were not graceful. They were messy, they were ugly, and bullets hit wood and earth and the occasional man. There were cries that were not the soft one I had first heard, but sharp exclamations, the sound a rifle makes when it demands to be answered. Ashcrow came down from his saddle like a man with old grievances and worse loyalty. He didn't aim to make peace, he aimed to make a statement, and it was a complicated thing to watch someone move, like they had two hearts tugging at the same rope. Some of his men stayed with him, others lingered, uncertain. Silas Grilly rode up with a crowd of men whose faces were cheap in the way men paid to look a certain way. He spat and then rode forward. I could see he thought the world was still one he could buy. Sajale stood in the yard with a rifle poised, and when Grilly drew near, she did not lower her eyes. She set her feet with the steadiness of someone who knows the distance between killing and being killed, and she took aim. I remember the moment not for the flight of the bullet, but for the way the world held still. The rifle cracked, and the air felt like something rearranged. Grilly's horse shied, and he fell from the saddle, an ugly human sound as he struck the dirt. The men around him faltered. The slaughter that follows a fall did not come because a woman had pointed a single rightness toward a wrong. In the smoke and the fog and the scrambling of men, Sajali did not look like a trophy or a prize. She looked like a woman who had been dug up and had decided the world would not bury her again. When the dust settled and we counted the cost, there were men down and some limping and a sheriff with a jaw like he had been taught betrayal. We were filthy and raw, and the land had the heavy silence that comes after a fight. I was wounded. There is always a cost. The bullet grazed my thigh and left a ribbon of pain that will be with me like a story I cannot forget. Sajal's hands shook and then steadied, and there was a look between us that was not gratitude and not triumph. It was something like mutual recognition. We had both been given a chance to be something more than what the valley tried to brand us. They dragged what they would drag back into town, rumor and the bodies of men who had been more interested in power than in the lives they stomped on to get it. Sheriff Rourke limped with a bruise to his dignity. Silas Grilly was gone like a bad tide. Ashcrow rode away uncertainly, carrying with him questions no man wants to ask. The vulture crowd in the sky realized the day's entertainment was over and wheeled off. We tended wounds that night with the same hands that had dug her out. Sajal sat with a small bundle against her chest that might have been the first of many things she would choose to keep. The neighbors came and said little and stayed late, bringing bread and one of those quiet kinds of sorry that mean more than words. We had won a battle and not a war. The law would not forget that night, and men with money rarely forgive loss. The world is a ledger, and now we had an entry on the wrong side of a few ledgers. There would be politics and grudges, and the slow grind of men like Silas, who find other ways to make a place theirs. The sheriff had lost his easy deals and might find another kind of partnership that suits him better. Ashcrow might come back with a different sympathy. The valley would hum with rumour. Sir Giles slept with a soft exhale that night. I watched the door and felt the old ache of knowing that to keep someone safe is to give your life to the work of staying awake. The hide of the world around us was thinner than I had thought. At dawn, I walked to the ravine alone. The place where she had been buried looked like any other scar on this land, a hollow with a few stones, and an old stake where a placard had been left. The word infertile had been knocked with an angry foot, and lay half-buried in the dirt. I set it on the rock and looked at it like a man does at a relic, a thing that had been used to wound. I thought of the way heaving dirt from around a neck can change a man's course. I thought of vultures, of men who keep tally in coin rather than in child and neighbour. I thought of a woman who had been given back air and what she would do with it. I could not imagine the whole answer. I could imagine only the next step. Her cries had been the first thing. The rest would be the long night work of stitching a new map across the valley. There would be clinics to build, conversations to be had beside fires, apologies to be made that will not make right the wrongs. There would be people who would refuse to come, and people who would. There would be a child, if the future is kind, a child who may be the small sign of a change that takes generations. I did not promise that to myself. I only promised the small thing. I would hold the door. I walked back to the cabin and found Sajale awake by the window, hands in her lap. She looked up as I came in, and there was a light in her eyes like one of those rare mornings when the sun decides to be forgiving. "They'll be back with men or they'll hire it out," she said. And then she gave me a half-smile that was not soft, but whole. "If they come, we'll be ready." I nodded because there are no other words that mean much in such times. Outside, somewhere down the valley, a rooster began to crow like someone attempting hope. The vultures circled but did not descend. The land held its breath like a man waiting to see whether another would move to kill or to heal. We ate in silence and made plans that were not heroic, where to hide water in case of siege, who would take the injured, who would speak with the neighbours. There were meetings to be had and loyalties to be coaxed, and the slow, grinding work of proving to a community that its worth was not measured in the number of cattle it had, or the depth to which it was willing to bury a woman. The sun climbed, and the valley pulsed with a kind of green hope that can come after a night's terror. Sajale strapped the rifle to her back, and we walked the fence line together. She set her boot in the dirt and left the kind of footprint that says, "I am here, and I will not be forgotten." There would be more men and other tactics. There would be an attorney from town with a silver tongue. There would be words spoken in the saloon that would make people's faces go pale. There would be a choice for Sajale, one that no one else could make for her. She would be offered restoration by men who had once put her beneath a stake. She would be told she could be taken back into the proper world if she would submit to their terms. The offer would be sweet and sticky as molasses and poisonous beneath. We had time before those conversations, the kind of time a man holds by gathering friends and stacking wood and baking bread. I found myself in the odd place of being both guardian and witness. I had taught a woman to load and aim and to stand, but she had taught me how to do a small thing I had forgotten, be unwilling to accept a world where people are buried for being less than someone else's measure. There was a letter from town that evening, a list of names and a lawsuit waiting like a trap. It said things like public nuisance and community order. It wanted us to choose between defending ourselves and letting the law be their instrument. I read it and burned the page in the stove. Law without justice is only an instrument of those who have coin to tune it. Sajale sat with the warmth of the stove on her knees and drew a small map of the valley in the dirt with a stick, marking in the places that mattered to her. She marked the ravine where she had been dug up and the place on the ridge where Grilly's men had watched. She marked the small clinic she dreamed of, not with exactness, but with a line like a promise. "You think this can be fixed?" she asked. "I think it can be changed," I said. "Fixing is a big word, it's a slow one, but we can change what people think is allowed." She looked at me then with an expression that was almost like humor. "It is the same thing as fixing sometimes," she said. Outside, the night came in, and the stars pricked open like pinholes in the world. There was a thin ache where my leg had been grazed, and a memory of dirt in my hands. There was a woman in my bed who had been pulled up from the earth and was learning to stand. I had no illusions about the road ahead. There would be more men, there would be more sharp, dirty business. But there would also be new hands, hands that would come to tend and to build if we could keep them safe long enough to do it. The valley slept with a tightness that is the precursor to storm. I lay awake and listened to Sajal sleep and thought of the child she might have, or the clinic she might open, or the names of the people who would come to mend a place that had been cruel. The vultures drifted far off, patient and circling, but not yet descending. The land holds its stories in the rhythm of those birds and in the sound of a woman who had once been buried and had learned to call for air. We woke the morning after like men who had slept through something loud and worrying and had finally been allowed to breathe. The yard smelled of spent gunpowder and bread and the wet cotton of bandages drying. Men sat on overturned barrels and chewed on silence. Women moved between them with bowls and care. The world kept the small economies of tending even when larger things unravel. I had a strip of skin on my thigh that tightened when I moved wrong. It would be a badge and a map for a while. The town did what towns do. It tried to sort itself into boxes that made sense. The sheriff rehearsed the look of a man who governs by the measure of his hat and found at breakfast that the fit was suddenly loose. Rourke Hale rode into town and found himself unable to buy the ledger he had relied on for years. Men who had been on his payroll said the ways of men with coin had changed. Some of them left. A few stayed and kept the kind of silence that is a bargain made with shame. Silas Grilly was gone, in the way men with means vanish when the market turns bad. He took his money and moved before the wind changed for good. Rumor said he had sold off part of the ranch to settle debts, and then rode out with a handful of men who still owed him favors. Men like him are a breed that breeds elsewhere. We counted ourselves lucky that the valley's teeth had not yet been stained by his particular kind of revenge. The coroner, what a grand title for a small town, took what records he could and tried to make meaning of the night. He filled his notebook, which is the way the world keeps innocent boxes in which to slide inconvenient things. Luke Carter, who had a mouth that could be nice or sharp as a file, began filing papers and making protests. He spoke of law and precedent and ledger balance. He drafted notices and petitions that would make Silas's absence matter in a courtroom, if a court would listen. Luke was a better man with words than I had any right to expect. He came out with a stack of papers and a look that said, "We'll make them pay in the only coin they respect, reputation." "You did what you had to do, Jack," he told me once, with the kind of sympathy that will be useful later in depositions. "We will file. We will keep pressure. We will drag truth into the daylight. But the law moves like molasses in cold weather. It is slow, and slow is the ally of those who have enough of everything else to wait. We needed faster things, care for the injured, food for neighbors, hands at the plow. We needed to build a place that refused to let a woman be measured by the absence of a child. That is work that does not arrive in a courthouse. It arrives in boards and nails and nights in the cold. There were funerals for the men who had been dead and for the idea that power could buy anything it wanted here. We buried what needed burying and tended what lived. There were apologies that arrived in the form of hands that did not look you in the eye. There were apologies that arrived with a blanket and an old man who had been on the ridge and now wanted a new story to tell his grandchildren. Those were better than nothing, though not always easy to accept. Ashcrow came back, not as a conqueror, but as a man with a question. What had he wrought? He rode in with a dozen of his kin, who wore the look of men carrying their choices under their sleeves. We met him on the road, and his horse stepped like it was a thing that had been careful all its life. "You did not bring the law," he said to me, under the scent of sage. "You brought a thing I do not understand." "I brought a woman out of the dirt," I said. "Is that not law enough?" He did what men do well who live with complications. He offered a different currency. He said that his people had been pulled between old compacts and new pressures, that some in his council had chosen profit in lands ceded, and that Dasan had spoken the words that had stuck like burrs. He did not try to make excuses in the way cowards do. He explained the politics of small kingdoms and the ways men can be made to think blame is a balm. Dasan came in later, shoulders hunched in the posture of someone carrying an old shame. He did not shout. He did not strike. He met Sajale with eyes that were too small for the wrong he had helped deliver. "I was wrong," he said, in a voice that had the sound of a man losing an old map. "I thought I was protecting something. I thought—" Sajale looked at him, and for the first time since I had hauled her from the earth, she let the full measure of her face be something more than survival. There was a hardness, and then a tenderness. "Speak plainly," she said. "The rest is wind." Dasan said things that sounded like repentance. He offered an heirloom, a blanket that had clothwork I could not name, and which might have meant something the people there would know. He offered to help build the clinic, to put his knowledge to the patching of flesh he had once misread. I watched Sajale as she took the blanket in her hands, the cloth catching in her fingers like a new world. She did not accept it as restitution so much as a wager. "If these hands will build with us, then we will judge them by the work, not the words." There were others who came with softer hands, neighbors who had been scared into silence, women who had kept their own quiet and now wanted to speak. They brought soup, mended fences, offered the small things that mean more than a speech. People lined up to bandage a wound or to teach a child to read. We had a woman, Marta, who had once been a school teacher in a town 3 valleys away. She took one look at what we lacked and set to making a roster. "We are not a city," she said, "but we can be a place that learns together." Sajale took to the work, like someone who had been given a map to a place she had been told did not exist. She walked among the neighbors and took measure of their pains. She did not fashion herself as savior, hardly, but she learned the small, flexible ways of clinic work. Where to set a poultice, how to find a vein that liked being found, the art of quieter words for those whose names had been snatched. She kept her own secrets tenderly. She did not make them public, because privacy is sometimes the last remedy a person has. Months peeled off like the skin of an onion. The legal battles roared and whispered in equal measure. The sheriff took a leave of absence and returned with less swagger and a lot more habit than I liked. Luke carved out petitions and depositions. He cross-examined men who had watchful eyes and thinner consciences. The court process cleaned up a few things and left others to settle in the dust. There were fines and some forced sales of property, and word that Silas was under more than one contract that would make his return awkward. Men began to realize that there is a cost to buying the silence of a valley. But if the law is a slow engine, restoration is hands-on and quicker when people decide to labor. We set to constructing the clinic in the old granary because it had walls and a roof and a history of holding things. We hammered and painted and argued over boards, like people who finally had permission to make noise. Sajale directed the layout with a practical mind that made sense. "Put the herbs here," she would say. "Leave a space for small ones. Make a shelf that can be locked." She had, in her own battered way, a plan for how the place should feel, warm, clean, and not quick to judge. We set up a school in the evening in the room next door. The kids came with awkward shoes and too many shadows, but with eyes hungry for maps other than these valleys of rumor. Marta taught them how to read the letters like little ladders. Eli came with stories about horses and the math of rationing, which proved surprisingly useful. Luke taught a small class on rights and the way law could be a tool if you had someone willing to swing it. The things we built, clinic, school, a meeting place, were physical, but they did a different labor. They told the valley it had been mismeasured. People who had been silent came forward to testify in town because standing in the clinic or the school that they had founded made them feel less anonymous. The truth, finally convened with bodies and words, made a dent. It did not fill the whole wound. Nothing does that quickly, but it made breathing easier. Grief has no timetable. I find that out in small ways, how a man pauses at a child's laugh, how he keeps a plate set at the table out of habit for someone who will never return. There were nights Sajal would sit outside and trace the outline of the ravine with her finger in the dirt, and I would see her counting the ways the land had taken and the ways it might give back. She did not speak about children much, but I watched her fold the edges of the healing blanket Dasan had brought and fold herself into work. Time is a peculiar thing. It makes a body knit and a story reweave itself in the muscles. Sajale learned to stitch wounds with the kind of hands that were both quick and tender. She learned to steady a child's fever with a poultice and to make tea that pulls sleep like a rope. She could watch a man who had been shamed all his life and make him sit and tell a truth he had been hiding. In the evenings she would practice at the rifle, but less out of need than out of the right to be able. One afternoon, months after the first dirt was pulled from her throat, she found me on the porch with a ledger. "You still flinch," she said, as if reading a ledger tells you something about a man. "You still look at the ridge." "Doesn't everyone?" I said. "No," she said, "not everyone. Some men put down one thing and pick up another. You kept the same weight. I had kept the weight because some things are literal. I had the habit of being ready to do violence to save a life. That habit can be ugly and noble and necessary, and it can make a man hard." Sajal took the line of my shoulder between her fingers, like someone smoothing a rough table. "You can learn the softer thing," she said. "What's that?" "To stay," she answered simply. "We were not lovers the way stories make them out to be. We were two people who had walked something terrible together and found a plain tenacity in the other. There was a kindness between us that did not require names for every shape. It was enough that she trusted me to hold the door and that I trusted her not to be a thing in the hand of someone else." Word filtered through that Dasan had offered to publicly recant his earlier declarations. There was poetry in small things. He stood in the meeting and said, "I made a mistake." Some called that insufficient. Some called it a start. Sajali stood and listened, and then asked him to help build the clinic without further words. He did. His hands were rough with his own kind of labor. It was not absolution handed on a platter. It was the offering of work to offset a wrong. Ashcrow came with other men who made reparations more quietly. Not all his people agreed with him. There were voices in his camp who felt that dealing with us was a betrayal. Politics has many rooms, and not all of them speak the same language. But there were elders who said a wrong done should be corrected if possible, and that included public aid for those who had been humiliated. They donated wood and their hands for a season. They did not take Sajale as their own because she had chosen otherwise. They offered a partnership of sorts, help rebuilding, building a medicine garden, sharing knowledge where appropriate. Sajale made one decision loud and clear. She would not return to be taken back by a community that had once buried her. She would not be the trophy that made them look good. She accepted help from many, including some from Ashcrow's people, but she insisted on remaining in the place she and the others had made, a chosen family, not a returned subject. Her choice did something dangerous. It pushed people to reckon that home can be remade, not merely restored to wounded precedent. People started to come from farther out when they heard there was a place in the valley that would treat a person without asking their lineage first. A woman with a broken jaw came from a neighboring ranch and left with a smile that made us all soft. A boy, who had never known a teacher, learned to read his name and cried with the kind of joy that is half astonishment. The clinic began to feel like its own kind of proving ground, not for the law, but for decency. We planted a garden with seeds that had come in pockets and sacks, things that, when they sprouted, made the place look less like a frontier scar and more like a hand's offering. Sajale took to the herbs the way some people take to prayer. She sat with them and named them and learned which ones calmed a baby and which ones pulled down a fever. She learned how to make a salve that smelled of lavender and something I couldn't name. She kept a small leather-bound notebook with remedies and little sketches of what went where in the garden. There was a pride in the way she tended that book. One evening, as the sun made the hills burn like old coin, she came to me carrying 2 cups of tea. She set one down and hesitated a moment. There was a look I had seen before. It was the look of someone who had decided to test a future. "I think I am with child," she said. I dropped the cup. The sound was small and ridiculous in the doorway. My first thought was absurdly practical. Do we have enough flour? Do I know what to do when a woman in labor needs me? The second thought was harder and richer. A life might be taking root in a place that had tried to deny them. She laughed at my lack of composure, because she had more grace than I did in the moment. "Don't look like that," she said. "It is not your fault." "It's not anyone's fault," I said. It's a beginning," she offered. "Not a proof of anything, but a start." We sat on the steps and watched the sky go the rusty color of old maps. There was a fear, yes. A child in a place that had been so mean seems at once a risk and a prayer. But there was also a tenderness that filled the space like warm water. We made a quiet plan. We would be ready with blankets and a knowledgeable midwife. We would keep the door closed to men who only wanted to judge. We would tell no one until the weeks turned into clearer things. News carried by the wind is a treacherous friend. People wanted to know. Curious men wanted proof. God knows there are always those who prefer rumors. We kept the news close between us for the first months. The valley hummed with small kindnesses and careful labor. Sajale grew in a way that made my chest throttle with a new kind of protective fierceness. The bump that grew beneath her clothing felt like a soft defiance to the placard once carved in men's plan. When the baby came, the weather obeyed with the kind of drama a story likes. The rain came. A hard, honest rain that cleared the dust and made the mountains smell like horsened soil. It came in the middle of a night when the wind made the cabin sing. Sajal woke me with the old steady hand that had learned how to wake me for danger. "This is it," she said, and her face was pale and fierce. "We had organized things the way you do, when you know some things and not others." Marta stayed by the door, eyes bright with the dedication of a woman who has saved more than one life. Luke paced like a man with too much goodwill and too little patience. Eli carried a basket of hot water and towels and swore quietly under his breath at his own uselessness. Everything we had built, the clinic, the garden, the trust, was compressed into those hours. Labor is a loud, honest business. There is pain and there is a rhythm that is older than law. Sajale breathed and brought the world closer with each breath. I held her hand and found that the instinct to fight was tempered by a new, different duty, to be there with what courage I had left that was not violent. I could not take the pain away. I could be solid where she needed solidity. The storm outside cut the lights down to a single lamp. Rain hammered the tin roof like a message from a sky that had noticed what we were doing. At one point, she looked at me between contractions and said, "You heard my cries once. Stay with me now, and hear me again. I have been a man of bullets and promises, and I have often failed at the things both require. That night, I tried to be better at what was being asked. I breathed with her when she needed me to breathe, and held her hips with hands that trembled at the enormity of the moment. There is a certain humility in seeing someone you respect bring life into the world. It humbles you into a better shape. When the child finally came, she made a noise that was both protest and arrival. Marta held her and cleaned her and cried like someone at a funeral and a birth all at once. The storm eased as if the world had decided it had made its point and could rest. The small thing wrapped in cloth had a mouth that searched for air and found it. She was round and furious and perfectly unconcerned with how we had been taught to measure worth. Sajal held the small thing to her chest and wept in a way that was not soft but right. "Grace," she whispered, and the name hung in the air like a benediction. It fit her. This child with the stubborn mouth and the fat, angry fists. The name fit the way people began to forgive themselves. We did not make any great claims about miracles. There were no banners. We had not cooked away the wagons of a cruel world. But in that small room, we had a child, without the need for an endorsement. We had a mother who had been buried alive and who now pressed a warm newborn to her breast. The child fed with the greedy intent of a thing that had every right to be there. The weeks that followed were a combination of euphoria and domestic grind. Babies make an ordinary sort of revolution. They get up early and demand attention and leave you better trained than you were. Grace, named so because we all wanted a thing that made sense of the day's mercy, grew with the same stubbornness that had lubricated Sajali's hands when she had first loaded a rifle. She sucked with a fury that made the adults laugh and cry in equal measure. The valley changed slowly. People who had once narrowed their eyes at Sajal now brought her vegetables and small toys. Men who had been willing to sign their names to nasty things came to help mend a fence or to haul a bale of hay because, in the course of feeding a small child, the heart is softened. Not all people came around. There were holdouts, men who were too invested in the old ways and who left, muttering of boundaries and how the world is. But those were fewer, and the voices that had been quiet before found a way to speak. Luke kept at the law like a man with a hammer and a stubborn belief it can be used right. He pursued accounts and titles and tried to make titles into instruments of justice rather than tools for theft. There were court dates and then more writs and countersuits, and every piece of law that turned against a man like Silas made it harder for him to find footing anywhere he tried to go. The sheriff, Rourke, lost some of his hopeful friends and gained a brittle conscience that made him less comfortable at his own table. Small victories. A suit settled, a sale reversed, a property returned. It was not grandeur, but it was enough. Sajal grew into a person more than a story. She named remedies and taught other women how to make salves. She taught children to stitch and to read their own names. When disputes flared in the market about where a fence should be, she stood in the middle like a steadying thing and spoke with the bluntness of someone who had been taken to the bottom and brought back. People listened. Ashcrow remained a complicated presence. He would come and sit on the ridge at times and look out over the valley. He and I would trade letters, less formal than letters, where we measured what was owed and what could be offered. He taught some of his people to help at the clinic, and they taught our children a way to tie knots in rope that I could not make sense of, but which were useful when a storm came. There was a slow making of trust. Trust is a brittle thing that must be handled each day. The years are a cautious thief. They take what seems permanent and rearrange it into a different order, but they also grant the thing I had been wanting in a quiet, practical way. A community that responded to harm with work and with relationship instead of with derision. The school full of voices grew, and the clinic that once had been a pile of lumber now smelled of liniment and clean cloth, and the sound of a child's laugh was no longer scandalous but ordinary. Grace grew like a stubborn plant, insistent and round. She learned to walk and then to run and then to bring a small fistful of wildflowers to Sajale. Once, when she was 3 and had the gravity of all children about her, she found the placard. the rotten wooden board with the word infertile, half buried near the ravine where it had once been planted as an accusation. She held it like it was a found treasure and brought it to Sajale. Sajale looked at it with a face that had learned the whole map of the valley and then steadied. She took the plank from Grace and laid it on the ground. "Not any more," she said. Then she bound a small ribbon around it and put it in the clinic in a corner, as a reminder of what we had to guard against, the ease with which people can be marked and the work required to unmark them. The ravine changed too. Where there had been only a hollow and an ancient ugly accusation, we planted a small garden. Children planted seeds with sticky fingers. We set stones in a ring and told the story of the woman who had been dug out. We, Sajale, me, Luke, Marta, Eli, told the story not as a legend, but as a memory with names and dates, because remembering with real facts is how you prevent the same thing from happening again. I've given a lot of time to the contemplation of what it means to be redeemed. Some men imagine redemption as a neat coin drop into a slot. It is not. Redemption is the long slope of days in which you do the small, stubborn things that build up into something that holds. I had thought once that saving a life might in some way wash me clean. It did not. It did, however, give me an obligation to try better. That obligation is heavier than the gun I carried and warmer than any armor. There were nights when the old reflexes came. I would wake with the ghost of a hand on my shoulder and think the world still needed to be kept by the barrel of a rifle. Then I would go out and see children playing and a woman nursing a child and a neighbor mending a roof, and I would feel the work done in 1,000 small ways. That is no replacement for hard action when it is needed, but it is a different kind of fight, the fight to make a place where a child can sleep and not be measured by the absence of something the world demanded. People came to visit from farther-flung places, bringing curiosity and sometimes generosity. They would ask about the story. How could a woman be buried for being infertile? They wanted headlines, the dramatic line. We told them the truth. Small greed and the easy purchasing of law make for terrible things. We invited them to stay and help build, rather than to look and take pictures. Some did, and we were richer for it. Sajale's name eventually stopped being a scandal in the market and became a shorthand for practical bravery. People called her Sajal the Healer, in the same way they might call the blacksmith's son Tom the Handy. It is a small thing, a victory over narrative. She did not become famous. She chose a life of steady labor and fierce guardianship. She refused always to be made into a story in which her body was evidence. She held the evidence back like a secret until people learned how to behave. The years cannot be summed in proud speeches. They are better told in small details. The way Grace learned to whistle, the way Sajal would hum while she tended a fever, the way Luke always misplaced his hat on Sunday mornings. There were funerals, there were weddings. Life kept happening. We kept at the work we had started not for glory, but because we had seen what happens when a place is allowed to cultivate cruelty. Once, years after the night I first heard her cry, I rode back to the ravine with Grace on my knee. She had found the old wooden placard and painted over the word infertile with flowers. She had used blue paint and messy strokes and her small hand. In the center she had written a word I had not taught her. "Grace," she said simply, "for me." We stood and looked at the place where vultures used to circle like they owned the valley. The birds were still there sometimes. Their silhouette against the sky is an old, indifferent constant, but they did not come to find human offerings as often. The valley had become something else, a place people mended and argued in, and sometimes fixed things in. It was imperfect. It was alive. I've been a man who measures the worth of a day by the number of times his hands performed a necessary task. There is, I find, a kind of success in that. A day when you awake and know you did not fail someone who could not stand alone. But the real measure, I think, is harder to find. It is whether you have the courage to be tender toward what hurt you, and whether you can resist the urge to name someone by their worst night. When the light fell that evening over Black Mesa, Grace ran ahead of us, chasing a sunbeam like a small dog. Sajale walked with a gait that had more softness than in the beginning, and less hardness in unkind places. We stopped by the little rock ring, and she knelt and pointed out a place to Grace. The child dug and planted an aster with tiny fingers, and then patted the soil like she was tucking in a friend. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked me later, meaning the whole impossible enterprise of staying, of fighting, of trying to make a home that refused old cruelties. There are regrets, always. There are nights I would have done different things in different orders. There are things I cannot undo. But to sit with Sajale and watch her child sleep with the steady breathing of someone who has been given time, that is better than the sorts of absolution I had hoped bullets would buy. There are no triumphant trumpets to herald the end of this thing. The world goes on rearranging itself into its various degrees of cruelty and goodness. We are a small island of chosen people on a larger map that still remembers its worst tendencies. But there is also this. People who had been willing to help when it required nothing now help when it requires something. That is a quieter revolution. On the ridge above Black Mesa, the vultures still fly. They are not wrong to do so. The land is a place of hunger and plenty. But where their shadow once meant only the presence of death, it now brushes over gardens and a schoolhouse, over a clinic with clean windows, and over a small girl who finds a stick and pretends it is a sword. The shadow is not the whole story anymore. If the first thing I heard that day, "Buried alive," that cruel placard, taught me anything, it is that a cry can be more than a sound. It can be an obligation. Hearing a human voice in a place where men preferred silence forced me into a choice. I chose poorly sometimes, I chose well sometimes. The point was not the perfection of the choices, it was that I chose at all. Sajale taught me how to live better than I had. Not by softening entirely, she would have laughed at the idea, but by showing that being dangerous and being caring are not mutually exclusive. She showed a woman could teach a man to be less of a gun and more of a door. She refused the world's verdict that a lack in the body meant a lack in the soul. She planted clinics and taught children and refused to be reclaimed as a prize. In the end, I have learned this. Survival is not an end, but a beginning. We can dig a person from the earth and tape their wounds and teach them to shoot, but the real work is in what comes after, what you build, who you help in the slow hours, the school benches you set, the blankets you stitch for newborns, the way you teach a child to call another child by their name and not a number. Grace gurgles in the corner now, asleep with a fist in her mouth. Sajal is mending a bit of cloth by lantern light. The world outside is noisy with the ordinary business of people who have decided to keep one another. The placard that once read, "Infertile," hangs, now an object children ask about, and we tell them, and then tell them how to better act. If this story of a woman who was buried alive and the small chosen family who would not let it stand has moved you, if you want more of these places where people are dug out and given room to live, like and subscribe and share this with someone who needs to hear that rescue is possible, and that after rescue, the long work of living begins.